All right. Well, good morning. Good morning. Shabbat shalom, everybody. On this rainy morning. Rainy mornings in the winter always make me think of, man, how much snow would be beginning of it was.
Yeah.
I'm always a little bit sad about it, but it's okay. I'm hoping for one more good snow.
Oh,
I know I'm the only one, but I love winter.
Because the crocuses are already starting.
I know, that's the problem. Is like it got so warm, so now everything's starting to grow, and it's like, no, it's not time yet.
Yeah, it's just waiting till my magnolias bloom, and then it'll snow. Nice.
But I like winter and snow. I've been loving watching the Winter Olympics. I'm like, look at all that beautiful snow and ice I have. It's lovely. So anyway, well, on to the task at hand. So this morning we have we're starting in Exodus 21. I feel like it's been a long time since I've gotten to teach. I don't think I taught in January. So
You did.
So I feel like it's been a while. I'm excited. So we're getting into the part of Exodus that's setting up for Leviticus, which is fantastic news. I know everybody's as excited about that as I am. So Lori's excited. I've got Lori on Team Leviticus finally.
Yeah, you do. My husband, not so much. But.
I know, but he's a good sport.
Yep.
He hangs with us anyway. But I love these portions because, of course, we're getting into next week. We start getting into the instructions about the tabernacle and the priests and all of that, which is super fun. But this week it's kind of this interesting portion because, of course, last week, and I wasn't in most of last week's Torah study. I was setting up for the table of the Lord, so I didn't hear everything. But last week we have kind of the first part of the Sinai experience, and then we have, and of course, the 10 words. And then we have more of the covenant and some of the instructions in the beginning of this portion, and then we kind of go back to Sinai. So there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot to unpack here. So we'll see, but hopefully we're going to make it through the whole thing. That's my goal. We'll see if it works. So this first portion, the first 2 chapters, I guess, 2.5 chapters, are giving instruction for all kinds of different situations. And we have lots of different topics covered. Many of them are the controversial ones that people like to point at for the Torah, saying that the Torah is, I don't know, that God is unjust or that he's against certain people and things like that. And I would argue that is not the case. But it's interesting because we've got slavery, we've got some different things about women, we've got things about murder, about animals, all kinds of things. So I'll kind of just open it up a little bit. If there's any topic in particular in these first couple chapters of the portion, and so we're looking at like 21, 22, and the first part of 23. If there's a particular topic that anybody wants to talk about, we'll start there. Otherwise, I can just say things.
Capital punishment.
Capital punishment. Say more. What do you want to? What?
Well, I think God's a fan of. I wouldn't say a fan, but he defines capital punishment here, and we live in a country where, there are a few states that have capital punishment, and then we have a bunch of other states where we have buildings full of murderers, and rapists, and why are we? They can make their peace with the Lord and go on down the road. Why are we financing the life of people that have killed other people?
That's a good question.
I have an opinion, don't I?
That's fine. So this is an interesting one because one of the arguments that people make about this topic is people talk about it's like, well, we can't, how could, if God is good, God, how could he want anyone to be killed is one side of the argument. But there's also this idea of justice and of course it gives some very specific guidelines about it. It's not so cut and dry, right? It's, there's circumstances where it's like, where if it's premeditated, if it's an accident, if it's during a robbery at night versus during the day. You know, there's all these different situations that it's bringing up. So it's not so cut and dry. And it's also, but there is also this theme, I think, running through, which is a difficult one to deal with too, is that it's required that they have evidence and that they have multiple witnesses usually and things like that. So it's not just based on the word of the accuser. So there's actually a lot to this justice and this, you know, this prescription. And oftentimes it talks about, in some of the records that we have, about many of the situations where it's told for whatever the penalty for whatever it is to be put to death, is that we actually don't have a lot of records in Jewish history that they actually followed through on a lot of that. And there's different opinions about why that is and different things. And we don't know that it didn't happen, but sometimes it's, you know, there's not always perfect records of everything either. But it's also often, like, I think it's often portrayed like they really felt the weight of that. Like you have to be 100% sure. It's not just, you know, we're pretty sure this happened, so we're going to carry this out. They had to know. They felt the weight of the action of it, so they didn't take it lightly, which I think is also really important to this in these situations as well. Yeah.
Well, I think it's significant that coming out of Egypt, which was a very, very corrupt system, you know, if you were in power, you had no limitations. You could do anything you want, and God is now having to change their mindset to something else, which causes us to value the way He values.
Yeah, a lot of these instructions, especially in this portion, are very much for that purpose of, you know, this is what you've seen. This is how you saw Egypt deal with all these situations. This is how all the other pagan nations deal with. I mean, the way of the world versus what God is saying is really what we're seeing set up here. And sometimes I think we miss that. And it does mention particularly about slavery. He specifically talks about slavery and basically being like, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, therefore you must not treat others as you were treated, is my very short summary of how that how that comes down. And of course, the slavery that's talked about here, I know we've talked about this in here before, but I feel like it's always worth reiterating, is we see the word slavery in our American modern minds automatically start to think the African slave trade in America and other places in the world, and that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about more like indentured servants. It's talking about, like, usually people were enslaved or in servitude because of a debt to be paid or something like that. And so they would work to pay off that debt. But as we can see here, it's very specific about, you know, slaves were to have the Sabbath off. They weren't to work on the Sabbath. They weren't to be treated unfairly, even though they could be punished for wrongdoing, but because there were certain expectations of them as a servant. But it also talks about, so the beginning of 21 talks about servants, and then if you skip over to verse 16, it says, anyone who steals a person and sells him or is found with him under his hand must be surely put to death. And so this is where we're saying that this is contrary to what we think of as slavery as far as African slave trade, because
trafficking.
That's human trafficking, that's kidnapping, that's in some sense stealing people, right? And this is saying you cannot do that, right? So, and even I think another important thing to notice about this is it talks about, you know, when this person's debt is paid, if they choose to stay with their master, which must mean that there's got to, you know, it can't be all that horrible. I'm not saying that people didn't take things too far. Not everybody probably did this perfectly, but the idea is that this actually shouldn't be, you know, I don't know. It's not what we think. Like I'm saying, it's not like what we think of as far as the terrible treatment of human beings. They're still human, is the thing, and that's one of the things I love about the Torah. And I think it's the same with women in some of these passages that come through and that talk about different things about women. Here is that in ancient cultures, right, slaves and women were sometimes not seen as human. And this is very humanizing of that. It's basically saying you must care for these people as human beings, even if there are situations where there might be, servitude or whatever because of whatever circumstance. They're still human and they must be treated as such. So, yeah.
Just to kind of to point out, and then the contrast of slaves in Egypt, bondservants to a good master, and of course the spiritual implications. And when you think of what the Lord has done for us, we were slaves to sin,
right?
And now we're slaves to righteousness because of our master. And verse 5 of 21 just kind of, I think, speaks that if that bondservant who could go free, when he says, "I love my master,
right,
and my wife and my children, I don't want to go,
right,
and be away from him."
Right.
That's kind of
our
relationship with the Lord.
Right. Yeah. And in some of these situations, it's like the alternative to either their slavery, or in some of these cases where women are maybe put in a marriage that they wouldn't have necessarily chosen, but it's if you think about the alternative, often the alternative is living on the street, begging on the street. For women, it's being a prostitute, it's being something like that. And so these situations are meant to be better than that, right? Again, like I'm saying, the theme is care as a human, even if the situation, it's not perfect, if that makes sense. But another idea that comes out, and this is something that Dennis Prager talks about that I really like, that fits a lot of some of these things, especially like there are certain instances where we might struggle with how this is portrayed, is remembering that it is the ancient world. Again, like I've already said, this is much different than how other nations or other cultures, how Egypt, or other pagan nations are treating people. And it's also the Lord is moving them in a direction. So in some instances, this is not the final, like today, like we wouldn't say if somebody has a debt that they would necessarily become your servant, your slave, right? We have other systems for that, right? We have banking systems, and we have, we operate in a world of money versus trade in goods, which is much more of what they would have had, so things are different, even though many of those systems were informed by these laws. But the Lord is pointing them in a direction and imparting character unto, right, like we've mentioned, like seeing the world and interacting with the world as God does versus how humans do, and how, in a way that it's this, in a sense, it's really this love God, love neighbor. Even in these situations where justice is being brought because someone, and the penalty is being put to death, it's by carrying out God's order of justice, it's still an expression of love God, love neighbor. So I think it's important to use that kind of framework as we look at some of these. Let's see. I'll read this. So one of the ways that Dennis Prager frames this is that these instructions are imparting or instructing in a worldview of ethical monotheism, and he kind of, I'll read this quote from his commentary. It says, "Unless we recognize there is a God above us and his primary demand of human beings is ethical behavior, and a moral God will judge us all, there is nothing to prevent us from oppressing those who are too weak to stop us." So it's really this order of like that God is the one that we're looking to, right? And he is demanding ethical behavior and learning morality from him versus from the world or from other people, or from what humans would want to do, the human definitions of justice. Yeah. So anything else on these first couple of chapters? Yeah?
So, the end of verse 6, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl,
Mm-hmm.
and he shall serve him permanently. So is this the first instance of wearing pierced earrings? Or is
It didn't say he wore an earring, it
No,
just
I
said
know.
pierced.
He was
with a
pierced,
hole.
yeah.
So does he just have to hold his ear?
I don't know. I think there's different ways to look at that. I mean, but this is actually a common. I mean, a piercing or something like this was a common way of designating, of showing, you know, this person is in servitude or slavery or whatever. And so I think it's probably the first mention in the Torah, but it wasn't a new thing. It was happening in the world. It was part of. It was a cultural reality at the time. So this is how it's to be used in this context, so to speak. But it wasn't that it was necessarily a new thing, if that makes sense.
I think later it morphed into them wearing a ring.
Yeah.
The master would give them like a signet ring that
Yeah.
they wore that stated
Yeah.
that I'm part of this
Yeah.
home, and they got that when they decided to.
Yeah.
So, like you said, this all kind of evolves. Like, here's a
Right.
marking. Now we've got these rings that we're
Right.
wearing as a marking. So it was kind of a progressive
Yeah.
symbol of just, I'm part of this house now.
Right. Yeah. Well, and giving jewelry, I mean, maybe not piercings, but even thinking of like when Abraham sends Eliezer, I was like, when is the name leaving me? To go find a wife for Isaac, right? He presents her with jewelry. It's not talking about piercing necessarily, but it's talking about bracelets and rings and things like this. So there's this jewelry, or this signifying that some kind of transaction has been made is very common. Did you have something?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that this is good examples of why we're not to just pick up the Bible and start reading and making judgments.
Sure.
That it really pushes us to study and not to study alone.
Mm-hmm.
You need to read what others have, how they've interpreted it. You need to discuss it with others and really think out practically, not just make quick judgments
Right.
with any scripture. Because I've heard it said, the reason the scripture is difficult is because we're too young. We didn't live, 4,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, whatever the case would be. And so we're not yet within that culture and that context. So it's so important to study, to not study alone, to talk with others.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the questions I try to ask as I read through the Torah, especially like in passages where it feels like you really feel that the world that this is written in is so different than our modern world that it makes it hard to connect, is like, what can I learn about the character of God? Can I learn about how God interacts with people and how God expects people to interact with one another? Because while we may not have some of these specific situations playing out, I think the principles remain. And we see that through the rest of Scripture. Like, as we keep going on it, like we're saying, we see some of these things start to kind of evolve and progress. There's a concept that Dennis Prager also talks about, that the Torah is both revolutionary and evolutionary. Whereas in some instances, so he would be revolutionary in that the example that he often uses is that, there's no child sacrifice, right? You don't, in the world, when serving and worshiping the God of Israel, there is never human sacrifice. So that is revolutionary in that it's a hard no. It's a no, we are not doing this. But in other instances, partially because I think I see this as the kindness of the Lord. Because think about, drastic changes to things. People question them, right? Like, if God drops the whole Torah on them, and I don't know, fast forwarded too much and said, you can't do all this all at once, they're going to be like, no. because they're human. And so there's things where he sets them in motion. He sets them on a path. And in that sense, he's evolutionary. In that sense, he's, because like Jacob is a good example. You know, Jacob is marrying sisters. It says later in the Torah, you can't do that. You know, but, and I'm not saying that it was God's perfect idea that Jacob marries sisters. We see that it doesn't go very well for him in many ways. But there's this evolutionary aspect to some aspects of Torah as far as how it's shifting culture and shifting practice in a way that is able to set them on a pathway of learning how God interacts again with humans and how humans interact with one another, but also helps them to be able to do it and build trust with God that this way is really better, instead of just saying, okay, all those people do all that and you're going to do all of this, like, hard break right now. Like, that does not really work, right? It's kind of like with children, like, right? Like, you don't give a 2-year-old the same expectations and rules and responsibilities in the home as you would give a 15-year-old, right? You're not going to hand a 2-year-old the keys to your car. Like, you're not, you're not going to ask them to keep their room clean or clean. Like, it's the expectation in some sense, because a lot of Exodus, in my opinion, is God parenting the Israelites and building trust with them, and as they become a nation. And so they kind of start out in this, the analogy I'm using is they kind of start out as toddlers, whereas you think about when they come out of Egypt, they see this miraculous deliverance through the Red Sea, and they're like, we don't have food and water, we need to go back. And it's like, excuse me? But he meets their physical needs, right? He gives them food, he gives them water miraculously, he supernaturally sustains them. And as we go, we see him progressively giving them more and more responsibility as this trust is built and as they're growing in being a nation of their own instead of slaves in Egypt. So that was a big tangent. But I think it's important to see some of those principles, and it can help us, give us a framework sometimes when we look at a specific verse or passage and we're like, sometimes it can feel like such a contrast to how we experience the Lord for ourselves, and also in our, how we understand our modern culture, that it feels like, how can this be the same God? And it's like, well, let's put it in context. Let's look at where they are in history, where they are in the story, where they are in this building the trust with the Lord, and where he's taking them and what is it pointing to. So it's this revolutionary in some senses and evolutionary in other senses. So I think I have found that to be a helpful kind of framework and a good way to look at. And I always say, try to look at what's their trajectory, where are we headed, what is this pointing toward, not necessarily like what is this, in this exact moment, because it's all connected, right? We have one continuous story. It's the same God of his character. He's just more patient than we are to get people to where they need to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say it's the same principle in our own walk with the Lord.
Yeah.
We're saved in the moment, but he doesn't dump everything on us at once. Right. And I would go so far as to say that's how he treats the Gentiles that came in.
Yeah,
as well. He
absolutely.
doesn't dump everything.
No.
Those 4 things, but they're going to be learning as they go.
Right.
What he expects of them.
Right. It's that working out your salvation, right, with fear and trembling. Salvation isn't a moment; it's a life. As you learn and grow with the Lord.
Well, and when we start this portion, this portion's Parashat Mishpatim, which is judgments. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden we're now getting these justice principles,
right,
which these people have just lived 400 years without justice, right?
Right.
And if they're going to be a light to the nation,
right,
and society is supposed to be an example, they're supposed to be an example of God's society, this is the right way to live, then, right off the bat, with the love God, love neighbor, but we've got this justice system being set up here. And yeah, he does do it in portions, but this is how I want you to live with each other. This is how I want you to treat other people. And it's important because you're not going to be a good light representative of him if you don't understand the principle of justice and judgments and making sure that people are treated properly.
Right.
And that's where we're kind of building into that. this is how God wants people treated.
Yeah.
And the big concept here is the certainty of consequences.
Sure.
And some pretty detailed rules and regulations, and, you know, the Lord's making it clear that, you know, as a humanitarian society, you've got to have rules, and you've got to follow them.
Yeah. And he's so clear about the consequences. I think it's interesting sometimes. I've heard people over the years, you know, be like, how could God, you know, as far, even looking at like exile or something like that, it's like, how could God, and it's like he tells them.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, if you do this, it will go well for you. And if you do this, it will not. And this is what will happen. Like he's very clear. And a good father, right? A good God, a good father follows through, right? Parents know that if you tell your kid, you know, if you throw that toy in the house one more time, you're going to your room, or whatever. I don't know, I'm being kind of silly. But like, and then they throw the toy and you're like, oh, well, it's fine.
No.
Is that gonna go well for you? Like, it's not, right? You have to follow through on the consequence. Yeah.
So we understand that by learning all this, that's why our Messiah asked us, go and make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't ask us to make believers. He asked us to make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And the disciples, the word disciple comes from the word discipline. The people who are disciplined. By learning all this, people are learning how to have discipline, how to be fair, how to be, that's a beautiful thing. When I discovered that, I was like, oh yeah, this discipline, that's what he's teaching us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like, and sin has consequences, right? Because ultimately, like what this is starting to describe and what we see through particularly Leviticus and Deuteronomy and the rest of, you know, through, like, is that as he's giving instruction, it's defining what sin is, right? We don't know what sin is without the Torah. And even after the coming of Yeshua, even though he carries, you know, he came to pay the price for sin, like, our sin still has consequences. Like, I think if we all look at our lives, we can all see those moments where someone else's sin has affected us or our sin has affected another person. That doesn't go away just because we believe and are a disciple of Yeshua. Now, he's kind and forgiving, and there's always a way back. Like, he provides, right, like the way back. But sin still has consequences, and sometimes we need to feel those to get us back on the right path, right? So anyway, it's good. It's a good conversation. Okay, we're gonna keep moving so that we can get all the way through. I promised that we were gonna get through, so we're gonna keep going. Okay, so Exodus 23. So this is still, the beginning part of this is still giving instruction, but many of these instructions are about, like, I would suggest in a lot of ways being a good neighbor, right? It's like if you find if you find this ox or this donkey, even if it's your enemies, you have to bring it back, right? And then it even talks about in verse 10, the 6 years you sow your land and gather the increase, but in the seventh year, you're to let it rest. And we know in modern agriculture, right, that land does need time to rest or, you know, to replenish nutrients and things like this. So it's like God knows. It's like God's a good farmer. My family are farmers, so I always appreciate somebody. Anyways,
so did your family follow that tradition?
I don't know about all of them. And my mom's family, they raised livestock more. They didn't have as many crops, but but there is, I mean, I would say in some sense, yeah, but not perfectly. But now there's more of the technology. It's like you rotate the crops because different types of, I don't know. Anyway, so, but I think it's a good principle to follow. But it's the point is that God cares about the land, right? He cares about, and in turn caring about the people, right? Because he knows if the land is fully depleted, then they're not going to be able to grow anything anyway. So it's both. And it talks about, kind of finishes this section with, in verse 12, you're to do your work in 6 days, but on the seventh day you will rest, so that your ox and donkey may have rest, and your son, and also the son of your handmaid and the outsider may be refreshed. So this Torah principle right? Because who's the outsider?
Probably at this point the Egyptians.
Probably the Egyptians, the Gentiles.
Yeah, the Gentiles.
I mean, it's arguable whether we can call them Israel quite yet, but
Yeah.
they are called the Israelites. So we're in the process, right? So, but the outsider, is a non-Israelite, right? But this is even extending to them, and at this point, the outsider is also probably has joined themselves to the Israelites in a sense, and so that they are not allowed to work. They're not allowed to participate in pagan worship. Is what I would say at this point. Faith, did you add something?
Well, I was kind of,
Sorry.
No, I'll go ahead.
Sorry, I just kept talking.
No, that's okay. I'll go ahead. To me, it just seems like it really establishes the principle that Sabbath rest, God knows living creatures need that, even the animals, even the stranger.
Right.
And I think it really is, I mean, it's established in other places, but I think that's one place where we can see.
Yeah.
Keeping the Sabbath.
Yeah.
God knows it's good for us and we need to do that, whether Jew or Gentile.
I think it's an important principle, and it's also a way to show, it's a way that God is able then to show His care and provision for all. Right? Because, and it talked about, we didn't talk about it specifically, but earlier when it's talking about servants or slaves, it talks about that they are to have the seventh day off as well, so that you can't, quote unquote, cheat the system, right? By like, okay, well, I'm not working, but I'm still making money, I'm still whatever, everything is still moving forward because these people are working. It's like, no,
and then they're
full stop. Right? And so, and this is very different. And this is something that even in the time of Yeshua, like if we look at some Second Temple Judaism, and this is something that was caused a lot of issues for the Jewish people, because the Romans would allowed the Jewish people to do their worship, but they were still interacting with Roman society, and Rome was in control of Israel. So, there was sometimes there would be mockery, or there would be, like, why are these people special? They don't have to work. They have 1 day a week. They don't have to work, and everybody else is working 7 days a week. And so it created some tension. So this is, I would say this is a revolutionary example of Torah. This is not the way the world worked. And it was often because life is hard. In the ancient world, life is hard. You have to work to live. And this is a way of God showing. But as we know, the Jewish people are often experiencing prosperity. Even in slavery they were, right? The first command given to man is be fruitful and multiply. And where were they fruitful and multiplying? In Egypt, in slavery, right? And so so there's this tension then with the rest of the world that these people are not working as much as we are, and somehow they have everything they need, and some are living, in many cases, living a better life than we are. How does this work, right? And ultimately, it's supposed to be unto this light to the nations principle, where the way that Israel lives is meant to show, point to the God of Israel, who we know is better than any other God, and for many reasons. So I think this Sabbath principle is definitely one that is meant to bless the people, to be a testimony to other nations, and to just show the sovereignty of God, right? That you can follow His instruction and still be taken care of. Okay, so then we move into this next section, and it starts about talking about some of the festivals. I like that we get in the second part of verse 15 of chapter 23. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. And it talks about observing the feasts of the harvest, the first fruits of their labor, and all of these things. And it starts to talk about some of the. It's talking a little bit about some of the sacrifices, which will be expanded on later as we get into more of the tabernacle and the sacrificial system later. The next section I really want to focus on, though, is verse 20 through kind of the end of this chapter, because this is something that really was kind of sticking out to me as I read through this portion. Lori's smiling, so I think she's happy maybe that we're going to talk about this. It's a good one. So I'm going to read a section of it. We'll break it up into a couple portions, but I'm going to read from starting at verse 20, and then we can talk a little bit. It says, "Behold, I am sending an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you into the place that I have prepared. Watch for him and listen to his voice. Do not rebel against him, because he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you listen closely to his voice and do everything I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. You are not to bow down to their gods and serve them or do what they do. Rather, you are to utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You are to serve Adonai your God, and he will bless your food and your water. Moreover, I will take sickness away from your midst. None will miscarry nor be barren in your land, and I will fill up the number of your days." Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second. So, this is, in my opinion, this is good news, right? They have this angel. Who's the angel? Yeshua. Going before them. It says that his name, the Lord God is saying, my name is in him, so this has to be Yeshua. And he's, it's kind of, this is kind of the culmination of what we've been talking about, is that he's going to go and bring them to all these people who are living in the land, because again, we know that even though this land the promised land is God's land and it belongs to the Israelites, there's all these other people living there. The joke is kind of like, it would have been nice of him if he would have just put a fence around it and saved it for him. And just like, here. That's not how it works. Which we're going to find out partially a little bit why in a little bit, which is an interesting thing. But he is specific to them that you are not to bow down to their gods and do what they do. Meaning, so this is what we're talking about. They're meant to live in a decisively different way, and to tear down their pillars, right? To tear down their altars, to tear down their high places, to tear down their places of worship to these pagan gods. You're not supposed to keep souvenirs of paganism. And he gives them this promise and this blessing that serving the Lord it's gonna go well for them, right? Food and water and prosperity, basically. Not, he's gonna take away sickness. The women won't be barren. Like these are good things, right? These are good promises. It kind of feels a little bit like, great, perfect. Of course we would do this. If this is what God is promising us, of course we're going to do all of these things. Unfortunately, we know it doesn't quite work out that way. but it's showing us that God's intention for them is to show this different way of living, this different way of serving God, this different way of worship that allows them to both overthrow their enemies and also live in prosperity. Okay, I'm going to keep reading, and then we'll discuss more. So this is verse 27. "I will send my terror before you and throw all the people to whom you will come into panic and make sure all your enemies turn their backs to you. I will send the hornet before you, which will drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in a single year. Otherwise, the land would become desolate, and the animals and the fields will multiply against you. But little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you are fruitful. Then you will possess the land. I will set your border from the Sea of Reeds into the Sea of the Philistines and from the wilderness of the Euphrates River. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you are to drive them out from before you. Make no covenant with them or with their gods. They must not dwell in your land and cause you to sin against me. For if you worship their gods, they will be a snare to you." Okay, so this is what I think is really challenging and really interesting about this situation. He is very clear, right? He said it twice in in these two sections that we've read. He said it twice. You are not to bow down to their gods. You are not to worship them. You are not to let these people live, basically. You're not to make covenant with them. And yet, he's not going to allow them to be driven out quickly. Right? It says he can't drive them out in a single year because the land will, right? Because basically the land will overtake them at that point, which is really interesting. So God is saying you must not be like these people, dwell with them, take on their gods, and yet you have to live side by side with them for a while. That seems difficult. I think that's one of those things that's like, okay, Lord, what is that all about? And it's this, but he makes this promise, this little by little, I'll drive them out from before you until you are fruitful. So it sounds like there's progressive situation where the people are being overthrown over time, while the Israelites are also theoretically multiplying to be able to take over the land and be able to care for the land and enjoy its produce and fruitfulness and all the things that God has promised them there. But as we know, and so it's like, but God in his sovereignty has to know that continuing to live among these people, they're going to compromise. So why would God put them in this situation to allow that? And I don't really have an answer. So I'm curious. I'm curious what people's thoughts are about this.
Well, it was evangelism. I mean, the Lord brought them out of Egypt with the mixed multitude. So there was always the opportunity for people to join themselves to the Lord's people.
Sure.
And so, when these people living around them see, wow, you guys are doing a lot better than we are. Maybe I should learn something from you.
Yes. But then that means that the Israelites are not good evangelists because they end up just being drawn away. Right?
But that's always the choice. We have it all around us today.
It's true.
We have prodigal children who've gone the way of the world.
Yeah.
Well, Rabbi Shaul, as they call him, says don't repay evil for evil, but overcome evil with good. And I think what I see is that principle is kind of maybe not said in those words, but that's put into effect here. Like even on the Sabbath day, if you have servants, treat them well. You see, TV shows about maybe some wealthy people and they have the servants and they mistreat them, and that creates all sorts of angst among the servants. But if you treat them well, then they're going to want to be with you because that's different from the way everybody else acts. And I think that's throughout the Bible. When you do this and you go among those people, God doesn't want anybody to be lost. He says he wants everybody to be saved. And so even though it costs us a whole lot, we are to act in such a way that maybe people can be drawn, into his way.
Sure.
And that's not easy. Wasn't easy then, it's not easy now.
True.
When you see what our society is like, to treat people lovingly, it's just easier for me to ignore them and go about my way, and you do your thing, and I'll do my thing.
Okay.
That's not what we weren't called to it then, and we're not called to it now.
That's true. Sandy? Got lots of hands, sorry.
Well, I'm just reminded of the when you spoke of the wheat and the tares. That, you want to get rid of the tares, but they're going to grow right alongside. So, and this is learning how to live among this, but be different, to be called out, and which is what we have to do as well.
Yeah.
It's also a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We will be a blessing to the nations. So they're pretty much telling them, you guys are going to be like teachers. If you guys follow the Torah, you guys will teach others how to do the things right.
Yes. That's true. Lori?
Well, in verse 13, when you go back, he says, with all these things that I've said to you, take heed, make no mention of the names of other gods, and do not let them be heard in your mouth. So he's kind of giving them, like, he's setting them up like, this is how you don't go after them. Like, if you're not putting that mention in your mouth, if you're not doing this, then it's not something you're recalling, it's not something you're participating in, because this instrument right here is what's giving that life also, you know, like, so when he's saying, don't even put that in your mouth. And so he's kind of giving them a template of how when you get with these people, here's a really good way of not going after their gods, is you don't make mention of them, you don't talk about them, you don't discuss, you don't, you know, it just, keep it out of your mouth, stay away from it, and then you can dwell in the midst of these people, because we see that in Israel right now. I mean, you've got Jewish people who really, really love the Lord, and they're not chasing after other gods.
Yeah.
So it is doable.
Yeah.
You know, it's just there's got to be ways to protect yourself from it, and I think he's given them ways to do it, but then everybody has their own decision.
That's true. Yeah. We'll go over here first.
Well, I was thinking, you know, getting Deuteronomy and the Lord, what's he telling them to do to each of these nations? Destroy the men, women, and the children.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the animals. So
right.
He's not giving them.
Yeah, and he's still saying here. I mean, what he's saying more than once is you have to drive them out, and really the Lord is saying he's going to drive them out. So it's sounding like it's not. I'm not saying that there's not an opportunity for these people to turn and worship the one true God. But the emphasis here is that Israel is not to turn to other gods. I think there's always, because I think there's an understanding that whatever God you're serving, you submit to whatever rules and authority is set up by that God. And so if these people are turning away to the one true God, it's understood that they would accept the rules and instructions of the God of Israel. But what we're seeing is that the risk is that the Israelites are only supposed to worship one God, and they're going to be, their risk is that they're going to be drawn away to these other gods. And to the practices of worshiping them, and this idea of polytheism that God is saying no to. So it's interesting to me that that God is so adamant that you not take on the ways of these people, and yet they're going to have to live among them. And I think the comments are good. I think what we're saying is that yes, there has to be this resolve or this strength or this empowerment by God to be able to continue to worship Him in the midst of other things, and we have to do that too. That's true. I'm agreeing with that. It seems very interesting. It seems very interesting from the beginning of this, as they're taking their land, and again, they're still growing in their understanding of the power of God and how to worship Him and how to live for Him, that they're in this really interesting, really challenging situation of conquest. Yeah.
Well, but when God told Abraham, you're going to be in Egypt, for 400 years, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So he knew that as a whole, and I'm not talking about individuals who couldn't be overcome by, repaying evil with good, but he knows that they're at that particular place, and they're on their last legs, but because sometimes when you make the choice and you just absolutely refuse, then God kind of puts you out of your misery.
Yeah, it's true. And yet we see that Israel doesn't do this. They don't do what they're told. These people groups are never completely annihilated.
Do we as humans, though?
No, I'm just
We're
saying,
not any
but I'm
different.
saying what it points to in that sense is that God is still sovereign, right? God doesn't unchoose Israel because they don't follow this out perfectly, which is the other, I mean, there's a lot of different facets to this. And I think, I'm not saying that the Lord set them up for failure, but he also does know the hearts of man. So it's how do we wrestle with all those pieces, and we don't have time to get into that because I promised that we were going to get to the good stuff. So we're going to have to move on in just a minute. But I'll say this. So I think that it's knowing that God has said this to them, that he gave them this clear instruction, and yet we know as time goes on that they're not going to follow through on it perfectly, nor do we follow perfectly through on being obedient to all the instructions and commandments given to us, and nor do we follow perfectly when we hear the voice of the Lord and instructing us to do something, and we still continue to experience his presence and his kindness toward us. I think that as we know the rest of the story and we see the history of Israel continue to progress, we see that, yes, but there are consequences for this, right? There are things about Israel's life as a whole that is made more difficult because some of these people were not fully overcome or driven out as they were supposed to be. And yet, God is still present with his people. He is still completing his plans. He's still using Israel as a light to the nations, and there are still the faithful among them, and that counts for something. So there's those different pieces, and it's interesting that it can feel a little bit to me like the Lord is setting up for a fair. It's like, Lord, if you didn't want them to be drawn into being enticed by these other gods, letting these other nations use their women to entice the men of Israel into pagan worship and idolatry and prostitution and all the other things, you should have just bam, they're gone. But he didn't do that. And so then we have to see how this story, and so God is not afraid of complicated stories. He's not afraid of things, of the promise of it taking a long time for his promises to be fulfilled. He's not afraid of those things. Maybe it's just me. I sometimes struggle with that. I'm like, can we just be done? Can it just be nice? Can we tie it up in a nice, neat little package and tie a little bow on it and move on? And that's not how this works, right? It's not how the world works. But we get to see a demonstration of God's sovereignty and faithfulness and kindness and compassion through it, and justice. We see his justice as well through it all, that I don't know that we would see otherwise if he had even though it would have been this dramatic, supernatural, whatever, it would have been, similar to the Egyptians being overthrown when the Israelites are delivered out of Egypt. We could have seen him do that again, right? He could have supernaturally made some kind of situation where all of a sudden all these people are just wiped out in a moment. But he didn't do that. But I do think that through that we do get to see his sovereignty and we get to see more of the character of the Lord through that, and how he partners with his people even though they're not perfect, which should give us a lot of hope, right? Because the tactic of replacement theology, right? The tactic of this idea that because Israel didn't accept their Messiah, then God transferred all of his promises from Israel to the church, is that it breaks our trust with the Lord. Because it tells us that if you mess up, he's gonna say, well, you messed up, next person. I don't want to serve a God like that. Not that doesn't mean we're not expected to be obedient and we're not expected to be moving toward a greater level of obedience and walking and living like he wants us to live. But his covenantal faithfulness to us means that we have a way back to him, which is also what I love about Leviticus. These ideas of this is how you're supposed to live. It's an ideal, right? If you do all this, it's going to be perfect. I'm going to dwell in your midst. You're going to be a light to the nations. The world will know. And yet, when you don't do this perfectly, here's how you make it right, either with God or with your neighbor. There's always a way to make it right. You're not written off. And so I think that actually through all of this, is we actually get to see God's covenantal faithfulness play out in a way that we wouldn't if he would have supernaturally just wiped all these people out. Yeah.
But we see instances of how it played out successfully with Rahab and with Ruth. So there were some instances in which that happened, and God just wanted it multiplied more. They not only came with the influence, they were so devoted to God that he puts them in the bloodline of Messiah.
Yeah.
And a couple of people.
Yeah.
So we know those two. We don't know anybody else that he has put in spheres of influence that came, from the pagan ways to God's way.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the faithful remnant, and there's always the opportunity for the individual. But what we're seeing is that, by and large, and you're right, I'm sure there were exceptions and instances and individuals from every one of these nations that said, "Listen, I want to follow that God," and they become the outsider with their midst. They covenantally join themselves to Israel, and at this time, there's not this Jew-Gentile distinction established fully quite yet. That's a more complicated topic. But they would have essentially been absorbed into Israel. So we don't always know all of those stories, other than some of the specific ones that are they're like Rahab and that we have and Ruth that we've had maintained. But what we know is that as a whole, these nations are not turning. Yeah.
So, like with the comparison of, this is how I always kind of process it, of why the Lord didn't just go in and, like he did with Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
Egypt was getting, the Hebrews were getting justice for what Egypt had done to them.
Yeah.
These nations haven't done anything yet, as far as, the interactions with them. So if we're looking at a just God who executes judgment against those who deserve it, and we also know we're talking about a God who not only loves the Hebrews, put his name on them, but God so loved the world, right? So for them to even be dwelling with them for a period of time in the midst of them, there is that, I wouldn't really call it evangelism, because I don't see like the Hebrews going, getting up on boxes and, type of, what I always think of street evangelism or whatever, but we see them through the example of how they're living. Yeah, some of these people could be drawn. And it's like every group that they're living in the midst of is getting a choice also. Israel's getting a choice. Do you want to continue serving the one true God, or are you going to go after their gods? And they're getting the choice. Do you want to stick with your crummy gods, or do you want to go serve the one true God? And so each group they're in are getting that opportunity to see how the better half lives, so to speak, and they get to make a choice.
Yeah. Okay. Last comment, and then we're gonna move on, because we have one more chapter we have to cover, and I want to get there.
A quick summary is it only takes volunteers. If you're his people, you got to stick with it. If you are not his people, you may be able to join yourself with his people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is this reality that every generation has to make their choice to be covenantally joined to God, right? Like the relationship of the generations before isn't enough. It is the starting point. It's kind of like the concept that we talk about is like the next generation stands on the shoulders of the one before it. So they are given a foundation, but then they're supposed to go further, and it has to become their own at some point. Okay, we're going to talk about Sinai. We got to get there. We got to talk about it. We only have a few minutes, but we're going to do it. Okay, I mentioned this briefly when I popped in at the end of Torah study last week about this pattern that we see established on Sinai, that the tabernacle ends up becoming patterned after. So I want to give a little bit more of that, and then it will set us up for next week as we get into the tabernacle itself, which Lori's going to take on next week, which will be fun. So really, when I talk about this, I kind of want to connect with, and I would suggest, we won't have enough time because we only have a few minutes, but I would suggest you to kind of look at Exodus 19 and Exodus 24 kind of together, because they're kind of giving a little bit of different points of view of kind of a similar thing, and we kind of see this by looking at both of those chapters together. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but I would encourage you to take some time maybe this week and just look at both of those kind of together, side by side, whatever, and see how to get the fuller picture of all of it. So we know from Exodus 19 that that everyone is coming together to be ready for this experience, even though they're not all going up on the mountain. They're all to be, cleansed and consecrated and ready, washed clothing, ready to go to this mountain experience. So I'm going to start at the top and go down, which means we'll have to jump around just a little bit, but I think we can do it. So the top of the mountain, as I was mentioning, is the kind of the parallel to the Holy of Holies. So the top of Sinai, only Moses goes all the way to the top of the mountain, right? This is where we have the cloud, the smoke. This is where all the action is happening in some sense. All of these natural phenomena are coming together with the presence of the Lord. But the rest of the people all know what's happening. Even though they're not right up there in the midst of it, they can see it and feel it and hear it and know that it's happening. And we know from so in chapter 24, verse 15, when Moses went up to the mountain, the cloud covered it. The glory of Adonai settled upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day, he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud, and the glory of Adonai appeared and was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. So Moses entered into the midst of the cloud and went up onto the mountain, and he was up there 40 days and 40 nights. So this is a little quote. So we have this 6 plus 1. We have this 6 days and then the 1. And so this is actually another thing that Sinai and the tabernacle both do, is point us back to creation and to Eden. And so this is a quote from the book Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord, which I love. It's mostly about Leviticus, but he brings in the rest of the Torah too, the rest of the Torah story. He says, here we find the 6 plus 1 pattern of creation. Moses, as an Adam, upon the mountain of God, enters the fire of Adonai's glory on the 7th